Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another one of my Gaudium at Space22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube videos. Doing lots and lots of podcasts this past week and into next week. I'm actually going to be interviewing Rod Dreher on next week and a few other people. So stay tuned. And today, a much delayed conversation with the great Father Tony Lusvardi, SJ. He is a Jesuit and he's an assistant theology instructor at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, otherwise known as the Greg, by Greg. Those of us who know Rome. So welcome, Father Lusvardi.
Thank you.
We had to delay this once, I think, because I was actually going to Rome, of all places. And because I came home early from Rome, I missed book launch that I was going to go to. And this book here is what we're talking about today. Baptism of Desire and Christian Salvation. All right. Baptism of Desire and Christian Salvation. Anthony R. Lusvardi, S.J. All right.
It's a very dramatic cover.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look at that. That's what is that picture there? Obviously, it's Christ being baptized by John in the Jordan River. What do you know the which particular sculpture that is and where it is?
Yeah, it's actually in here in Rome, San Giovanni dei Fiorentini, which is over near the Tiber River. And I think the sculptor is Antonio Raggi. And I didn't actually, I'm very happy CUA Press did the design for the book cover, and that wasn't one of the sculptures that I had suggested, but they found it. And so I went and walked over there and saw it and said, yeah, I think that'll do.
What a lot of average people don't understand is that we authors of books have very little input in what the title of the book ends up being, what the cover art is going to be, all those kinds of things. And so fortunately, the people that do those things usually know what they're doing. So it's good. And my book, the one that just came out with Ignatius Press, I love the cover art. That was, if I had chosen the cover, it'd be a stick figure and a few things. Anyway, you were going to say, I interrupted you.
I wanted to call the book Water, Blood, and Desire, but they said that sounded like a pirate romance or something like that. So, is that a bad thing?
Could have had a picture of you on the cover with an eye patch or something like that. Yeah. All right. Water, Blood, and Desire. Okay. So baptism of desire and Christian salvation. Obviously, this is a topic that is very, very pertinent to this day and age because one of the great, it seems to me, unresolved theological questions of the modern era in the Catholic Church is just how extensive we are to and inclusive we are to understand salvation, and how necessary water baptism is for salvation. What in the heck salvation even is? What we mean by salvation. And then what we mean by, baptism of desire, because it seems as if obviously the modern church has moved to an ever more expansive understanding of what we mean by extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Outside of the church, there is no salvation. Maybe at one time in the church's history that was interpreted very narrowly, with a few exceptions for salvation outside of the visible church. But now we interpret it very inclusively, expansively, to include almost everyone, it seems. So it does seem to. Yeah. So, okay. So why don't, what motivated you to write this book? Was that part of the problematic that impressed itself upon you?
Yeah, it certainly was. And I think, as I thought about when the idea started, I would say, in some ways it goes back to during my Jesuit formation. During Jesuit formation, we do this period of work in the midst of our studies called Regency. And I ended up, and most Jesuits end up teaching high school during that period, but I ended up on the Rosebud Indian Reservation in South Dakota.
Wow.
Working, as a missionary and working in, there were some accidents and I ended up running 3 of the parishes there. I wasn't ordained yet, but it was an adventure.
Is that near I don't mean to interrupt, but geographically, is that near the Black Hills or is that further east or?
It's actually near, so you're from Nebraska. It's near Valentine.
Oh, yeah.
right on the
Yeah.
other side of the border
So sort of
from Nebraska,
South Central
middle of the
stuff.
state. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
By the
Yeah.
Badlands, in the Badlands.
Exactly. Yeah. And the Badlands are great. I mean, it's a view. I love going out there. I go out to South Dakota every summer now, and usually in
Yeah.
Rapid City. But uh, one of the things that struck me was the mission was important, the, and there was this sense of we're not quite sure why it's important.
Yeah.
There's this sense of we know we should be evangelizing. We're a little bit uneasy talking about evangelization in relation to salvation, because then it makes it seem like if you're not evangelized, maybe it's less likely that you're saved. Maybe you're not saved. However, we don't want to touch that. And so it seemed to me that when you don't know why you're doing something, it creates problems in the way that you do it. And as you're saying, I think that this is a problem, not just not just among Jesuits, not just in South Dakota, but really is there's confusion in theology about how to talk about the church's necessity, the necessity of the sacraments, in a way that maintains that necessity, and at the same time doesn't make. And I would sort of put the line: the minimum doctrinal position that we have to hold is it means that nobody can be in principle excluded from salvation. And so how to hold those things in tension. And then when I went on to theology studies in Boston, it really, I would say, it confirmed my suspicion that that theology had not resolved this question. And there's a very Runnerian bent, I would say, there to the theology that I studied, that was kind of in the air. And so it was very difficult to talk about the church's mission. And a lot of the attempts that theologians of that kind of Runnerian school, the attempts that they made to talk about the church's mission seemed to me very weak, frankly, where it became, well, we need to point out salvation where it's already there. And that sort of didactic and interesting, but that's not, I think, how the apostles understood their mission. Um, and uh, and so it seemed they were stretching, and
Yeah. Yeah.
the line between being a missionary and just sort of being a tourist, there to to dialogue with people. What I realized on Rosebud, on the reservation, was, um, you know people don't need outsiders coming in just to be with them. Uh, uh, that's in some ways a sort of self-indulgent sense of mission. And so it seemed to me that there was a lack there. Um,
Yeah.
when I got to Rome, it was to study sacramental theology, and my interest in sacramental theology really arose out of that experience as well, being in the parishes there on Rosebud, and realizing that the the church's, most people's experience of Jesus Christ, most Catholics' experience of Christ, happens through the sacraments, and their Christian formation, the evangelization, the catechesis. It happens in relation to sacramental preparation and their participation in the sacraments. And I realized too there are some problems with the way that we do sacramental preparation and celebrate the sacraments, and um, the our retention rate after confirmation, for example, is not great. It's not what it should be. And so that really made me think, well, this is something that deserves more attention theologically.
Yeah. I mean,
And
but let's stop you there. I mean,
yeah.
I think it was even Pope Francis who recently made a statement along the lines of, well, confirmation is almost like the sacrament of emancipation. It's like
Right.
it's when people leave the faith.
It's like graduation.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and the
I've
way that we
graduated from
celebrate it.
catechism now. It's now I get to go out of the hell out the door and never return.
Yeah, yeah. I'm teaching a seminar right now, or guiding a seminar on confirmation, and it's interesting because across the board in different parts of the world, that same problem is very visible, and I think it has something to do with the way that we've organized, or the lack of the way that we've organized the sacraments of initiation.
Yeah, and
Um,
one last interruption. I keep
sure,
interrupting your narrative,
no,
but
that's okay.
my wife has a PhD in sacramental theology, and she did her
Cool.
work on a Jesuit you might be familiar with, Edward Kilmartin. Uh,
Yeah. Hmm.
and I don't know to what extent his theology is pertinent to this conversation, but I know my wife would be very interested in this conversation. But anyway, I interrupted, so you continue. You get back to Rome, and this issue is burning within you. The ambiguity of what role do the sacraments play in salvation is essentially, so it's not just about
Yeah.
baptism, it's about the whole sacramental order.
Right, exactly. And that's, so I'm making and I knew that this concept of baptism of desire existed, and it sort of seemed, well, this could be a way to bring together sacramental theology and these questions about mission that I think are very important. And it is sort of a fundamental question, at the beginning of your career in studying sacramental theology, you should have a sense of why it matters. And so that it seemed like a good question to begin with. Um, the the good thing, in terms of writing a doctoral thesis on it, is everybody agreed that it was an important concept, but nobody had really studied the concept of baptism of desire per se in any sort of depth recently. And so
Yeah.
there was kind of an open
Yeah, I mean,
field there.
and your book is very thick, and it's essentially a historical unpacking of how this
Uh-huh.
notion of the baptism of desire has evolved over the centuries.
Right, right. And so, as you're saying, it's putting together the sacramental theology and the question of salvation. And what I realized in going through and working through all of the history, and this is the edited version of the book. I cut I don't know, 25% out of it,
Oh, I
in order to make
know.
it more legible. And
Yeah, that's
um,
the bane of all of our existences. The wicked editor says this is too long.
although, I have to say, I really enjoyed that because it made me say what was most important,
Yeah.
and cut out everything. And, it helped me. It was a really worthwhile exercise
Well, I think
because,
another tangent would be, I think that
yeah,
a lot of us scholarly academic types always have in the back of our heads the chirping bird voices of other theologians saying, but what about this? And what about that? And what
yeah,
about this? And so you say, well, I better say something about the, but the average reader, just interested in the topics, just wants you to cut to the chase. Let's just get to
yeah,
it.
uh-huh, yeah. So, so I would say that working through all of that history is actually essential, that it really is
Yeah.
important. And, that it's not just, the history isn't just, sort of interesting background. Um, because what I really found, and, one of the central arguments of the book, is that part of the reason that modern theology, so theology from the 19th century and 20th century, and I put those together kind of as a group, because I think that essentially the problems are the same, that we're sort of stuck in the long 19th century, I call it, sort of ironically, because
Yeah.
the people who use that phrase, O'Malley talking about Vatican II, sort of gets extended. And so I say, well, why don't we just say we're still in the long 19th century? Because the problems go back at least to that, to that point. And it has to do with, we've in Baroque scholasticism, and and following, we stopped using the sacrament stopped figuring in a major way into the way that we did theology, the theology of salvation, the way that we talked and reasoned about salvation. And so it became more of a almost a legal process. And so my argument is that we need to start our reasoning from the sacraments themselves, and that our way of celebrating the sacraments, what they are, actually gives us important data for doing theology, and that changes the very nature of the way that we approach the conversation.
Okay, stop there for a second because I think that's very important. And you do go on at length about this in the book, which is that in Baroque scholasticism, first off, for the sake of my viewers, explain what Baroque scholasticism is. And secondly, when you say that their concept of salvation had become largely a kind of legal thing, maybe unpack that a little bit more so that we can understand better what you're contrasting your approach with.
Yeah. Baroque scholasticism. So you're dealing with so you have your sort of classic medieval scholasticism of
Right.
Thomas, and then after the Council of Trent, everybody is quoting Thomas or thinking that they're following in Thomas's footsteps, and sort of following that method, but it's becoming more and more complicated. And Baroque scholasticism, the Baroque should conjure up all the images that word that word carries.
Incrustation upon incrustation upon
Yeah,
incrustation. Yes.
yeah.
Ornamentation, baby.
Right, exactly, and try making more and more fine distinctions, and and there's some value in that. I don't want to say I don't want to dismiss any era of the church's theological tradition as as a waste or a mistake. I think that there are things that we can take from all of them, but it became more of an theology became more and more abstract. And so more and more sort of a word game, a category game, and that's moving you very much away from the concreteness of the sacraments.
Right.
And I think
Right.
it moves us away from the concreteness of the encounter with a person. And so in the 20th century, I think one of my favorite theologians, Ratzinger, in one of his encyclicals, I think Deus Caritas Est, but I think it gets repeated several times, where he says the encounter with or Christianity is not just a matter of following the rules. It's not just a collection of dogmas. It's an encounter with a person. And I think that that's the sort of thing that gets particularly obscured in this scholastic way of doing theology.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I think that's, I mean, would you say then Baroque Catholicism was probably heavily influenced by Suarez and the Suarezian emphasis on revelation as a set of truth propositions?
Yeah.
And I think this is an important point to understand as to then exactly what it was then later that the Ressourcement theologians, which is a movement that you can maybe even tie with Shaban a bit, or the Nouvelle Theologie, whatever you want to call it, what it was exactly they were reacting against. In other words, they weren't attacked. The accusation is sometimes leveled that they were attacking a straw man, that scholasticism was not this evil boogeyman that and there's probably some truth to that, right? That
Yeah.
in all of these theological disputes, boogeymen get set up and straw men get attacked, and in
Right.
the heat of battle, caricatures are made. But nevertheless, Baroque Catholicism, Baroque scholasticism, Suarezian scholasticism was a real thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And I would say, I'm following in a lot of ways the now I'm blanking on his name, the great Pinckaers, Servais
Pincus,
Pinckaers criticism of, I mean, so he's a theologian who's working in moral theology,
right?
and he is a Thomist, and he's making a very similar sort of argument in saying that in the realm of moral theology, you have all these people during the same era of Suarez and going into the manualists in the 19th century that would moral theology comes to be very, very rule based. And so it's just a matter of obedience to law. Um, and uh, and you lose sight of what's the goal of the law. So you lose sight of becoming a virtuous person. You lose sight of becoming Christ-like.
Yeah.
Um, you lose sight of what salvation actually means. And so I'm making a very similar sort of argument and saying, well, this you see
Yeah.
the same sort of development with regard to sacramental theology. And if you go back to the early church, and there's a quote which my students are probably, if any of them listen to this, are probably sick of hearing. But it's a quote used in the Catechism from Leo the Great, his Ascension homily, which says, "What was present and visible in the Lord when he walked the earth has passed on into the mysteries, has passed on into the sacraments." So there's the sense of there's this encounter with the incarnate Lord, with Jesus, that happens in the sacraments. And this is something to unpack a little bit more, but I think that this is the fundamental way of thinking about the sacraments that comes out of the church fathers, that they're an encounter with the humanity of Jesus, that that there's the part that we can touch, is that saving humanity, the incarnation of Jesus. And and of course it's easy to see then why that is necessary for salvation, because that's what salvation is. Salvation is
Yeah.
knowing Jesus. It is that sort of relationship with Jesus. What happens over the course of centuries, and if you don't believe me, you can read the book, is because I go into detail, is is that the the sacraments come to be explained in terms of, well, why are they necessary? Well, there's this rule that Jesus said we have to be baptized. We have to follow the rules. And so if we disobey the rules, we're going to be punished. Um, and and so then that's a very different way of thinking about the necessity of the sacraments. And that's what I mean when I talk about it moving into, Baroque scholasticism, giving us this legalistic basis for thinking about the necessity of the sacraments for salvation. And there end up being a lot of, I think, very problematic things that come out of that way of thinking. And that's what gets us into this mess in the 19th century and the 20th century, which we haven't quite been able to get out of.
Yeah, we really haven't. You know, all that being said, I mean, one of the things that strikes me, I was watching a Word on Fire video with Bishop Barron once, and he was addressing the question of why do we need to evangelize if it's possible for non-Christians to be saved?
Mm-hmm.
And he began by saying, well, for starters, because our Lord commanded us to evangelize. So in one sense, yeah, I mean, that's a very baseline. If that's all we have is that the Lord has commanded us to baptize people, go into the whole world, make disciples, baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. If that's all we had, we would still do it because he commanded us to do it. But it would not give us an understanding in a sense of why he commanded us to do it.
Right. Which actually affects the way that you do it, the how of it as well. And if you can't answer that why question, then you're not going to be a very effective evangelist, for one thing. And it's almost not fair to the people that you're evangelizing,
Okay, so
in certain ways.
what is, before we get to that why,
Uh-huh.
because obviously you do hold the position that salvation is possible for those who live outside of water baptism.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to get to that question of how. So
Yep.
let's first begin though by going after then this concept of, well, there's a kind of baptism. It's not a water baptism. We give it this fancy name, the baptism of desire. And
Uh-huh.
it seems as if originally all that kind of meant, if I read your book properly, was if you were a catechumen and you were getting ready to be baptized and then you were You got killed in a horse cart wreck, you know, 2 days
Right.
before baptism, that you were probably saved because you had a baptism of desire. So anyway, unpack this idea for us of
Yeah.
baptism of desire.
So, I mean, so one thing I think you have to keep in mind is how strongly felt the necessity of the ritual was among the church fathers. So, baptism of desire, to us, it almost seems comical that that example, because it's so obvious. Our sense of fairness, our
Yeah.
whatever, our modern sensibility. Would say, yeah, of course, the catechumenate who gets run over by a chariot on the way to the Easter Vigil, of course, he's
Yeah.
going to be saved. But for the church fathers, that definitely was not obvious. And there was quite a bit of debate over whether baptism of desire was a legitimate concept up into the Middle Ages, I would say, where you have serious opposition to it. And so that's something to keep in mind as background. And I would say, though, that along with this very strong sense of the importance of the rite, the importance of the ritual, and I think it's because they had this at least implicit sense of there is something in the ritual that you can't invent a substitute for, and I think that's right. Um, it's just like that of a person. It's that sense of encountering the person of Jesus. Well, people aren't just substitutable with principles or other people. That there is something about the uniqueness of Jesus as a person, which has passed on into the uniqueness of the sacraments. That I think that the early church, they understood on a felt level, that you can't, if you're saying, well, it's the thought that counts, then you're missing something.
Okay, stop right there
So
one
that's what
second,
makes
because
it difficult.
what you're tying it to, therefore, is the scandal of particularity. In other
Hmm.
words,
Exactly.
just as the first Christians and then any Orthodox Christian since would say, yeah, the incarnation of Christ is the linchpin upon which all of salvation history turns. All salvation comes through Christ, the incarnate one. As scandalous as that historical particularity is, I mean, it's scandalized Enlightenment figures like Gotthold Lessing, who
Hmm.
developed this great ditch, that the ditch,
Yep.
the contingent truths of history cannot, in a sense, form sort of universal truths. Only universal reason can. This is the whole mythos of the Enlightenment in which we now still live.
Yeah.
That something's universal. So Christ stands as this gigantic stumbling block of particularity. And your claim is that the church fathers' claim was that the sacraments are the same, are caught up in that same scandal of particularity.
Yeah, and what you start to see is, so fast forwarding to the 20th century, once you start to lose the particularity of the sacraments, and the ritual goes, which starts to happen in the 19th century, then in the 20th century, what you start to lose? The particularity of Christ. And so the developments, it's those things are tied together in ways that
Yeah.
I think Catholics probably deeply feel or can intuit in some ways, but might be hard to explain. But the once you lose the particularity of the sacraments, it's only a matter of time before you lose the particularity of Christ, I think.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And you see sort of, depending on your point of view, a runaway extrapolation of Rahnerian principles, or those who support Rahner's theology, who believe that he's simply been mischaracterized and misused by his epigons that came later. Whatever your point of view might be, there's definitely a Rahnerian trajectory, as my friend William Portier calls it, a Rahnerian
uh-huh.
trajectory. Whether it's linked to Rahner or not, we can debate. But the Rahnerian trajectory was in the direction of saying that the world is always already so deeply salvifically engraced that evangelizations and even water baptism and all the sacraments simply consist in making thematic what is unthematic, making explicit what
Right.
is latent.
Hmm.
So it's simply the teasing out of a salvation that's already there. So that is precisely what I think what you're saying, that relativization of Christ follows in the wake of the relativization of the sacraments, because that is
Yeah,
eventually then what happens. If people are
right.
always already salvifically engraced, then how are they being salvifically engraced if not through their own religious traditions?
Yeah, and I think the thing that I want to point out is the link between that sort of Baroque scholasticism, this move towards greater and greater abstraction, and Rahner, that which is why I think the book is it's a little bit hard to fit into some of the standard categories that we have for talking about theology today, whether it's conservative or liberal or what have you, because I'm pretty hard on the scholastics and the sort of preconciliar theology, but at the same time I'm hard on them because I see where they lead in Rahner, and I think um, that misses quite a bit. I think what
No,
he does is he preserves some of the getting. So this is getting into some of the nerdy theology stuff, but
no,
he
it's
he
important.
preserves he preserves the some of the principles of Catholic sacramental of scholastic sacramental theology, because he is. I mean, he's a very bright guy, and he really knows that tradition, and he preserves the sort of the machinery of it, or the some of the categories of Thomistic scholastic theology, but he removes the actual sacraments. So I think, for example, to give one example, I think his supernatural existential essentially does the work of baptismal character. So you have the same sort of intellectual framework, but he's just removed baptism and inserted this abstract category, which I don't think anybody really knows what the supernatural existential is. But
It's always when I read Grundkurs, yeah, what's the English Foundations of Christian Faith?
Yeah,
I remember still wondering what in the heck is an existential, what is a supernatural
right.
existential, how is he using the scholastic category of an obediential potency, uh, all of that. But what remains, what really struck me, since I'm a Balthasar scholar and I'd studied
Hmm.
Balthasar for my dissertation, what struck me when I'm reading Rahner when I was at Fordham, Jesuit place, and it was thoroughly Rahnerian, was how scholastic Rahner is.
Yep. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right. I think that's
Yeah,
right.
I remember thinking, wow, he's following a scholastic framework and scholastic categories, but he's relitigating them in the light of the turn to the subject and his
Yeah.
transcendental analysis. It's a little cliche to say that Rahner turned to Kant, but Rahner is a post-Kantian German thinker and
Yeah.
does want to take into account the immanentist traditions within the Christian faith more so than but it's a kind of immanentism that never quite gets around to the objective structure of revelation. That's
Yeah.
Balthasar's critique.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. Because I think um, I, I think in order to reach the results he wants to reach, for salvation to be as universal as he wants it to be on sort of the terms that he gives, it just has to become more and more and more abstract, so that any concreteness at all, anything definitive at all, would exclude somebody, and that's something that he because of the way that the theology is
Yeah.
developed, because of he can't do. So
Well, here,
I
okay.
realize
So
that we've gotten away from the first century, but
oh, we
so,
have. We've
so
gotten sort of radically away from the first century, and we're going to come back to it. But I want, but this, all of this stuff is of such interest to my viewers and listeners, uh, because they're always looking for, okay, how does this continue to resonate today? I'll just leave it at this, and then we're going to get back to the first century and baptism of desire and how it historically unfolded. But one of the things that interests me, then, of course, as a Balthasar scholar, is how Balthasar in a sense, is highly critical of Rahner. And Balthasar wants to emphasize the particularity of Christ, the particularity of the church, the particularity of the sacraments, all of which are necessary for salvation. He develops this whole aesthetic of the Christ gestalt, which is absolutely irreducible and so on. And yet Balthasar is the one most associated with a kind of universalist impulse. Was dürfen wir hoffen? Mistranslated as dare we hope that all should. It's really, what are we allowed to hope for? What may we hope for within the confines of the tradition is what he's asking. Well, his conclusion is, well, we can hope pretty expansively here, but that then necessitates a kind of reworking of all of this particularity stuff. So it's just sort of and Balthasar never resolves that tension. He doesn't.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I don't deal a lot with Balthasar. So, that was one of the things where you realize you have to draw a line and you can't answer that's one of those birds that have left twittering in the background of the book.
So I keep interrupting you with all these digressions, but go ahead and continue your narrative of the baptism of desire.
So the one thing that I think is important is even in the very early church, you get hints that there's this strong affirmation of the necessity of the ritual. And at the same time, there are these hints of, well, maybe in some way the ritual might sort of be more expansive, if you will. That I talk about hard cases. So, the early Christians are going to have relatives who died the day before St. Paul arrived, and so didn't hear the message, and they're going to say, there's something there that we wish we could say more, and so you get the hint of it. I claim is there are these sort of almost mythological stories, passages that pop up in, like, the Shepherd of Hermas, for example, where in the afterlife there's this image of, so that's 2nd century, really weird kind of trippy writing of visions of the shepherd in this Hermas, and was considered very authoritative in the first several centuries of Christianity, and then was kind of forgotten by later theologians. But there's this image in that work, so 2nd century, of the apostles in the afterlife, and there's a lake there, and they're baptizing people in the afterlife. And so you get this sense of, well, maybe there's, salvation extends a little bit beyond what we could see, but baptism still has to be a part of it. And that's a very different sort of way of thinking than, the 20th century of Rahner or even Balthasar, where I think it becomes, well, we have to, it's something it's a more intellectual, it's a more abstract way of thinking about it. And I'm contending that, we maybe would sort of look back on them, and our tendency is to say, oh, how quaint, how cute. They use these mythological figures and so forth. And I want to say, wait a minute, there's something that those sort of figures and those sort of images can convey that is important. And, there's more in heaven and earth, Horatio, than is dreamt of in your philosophy.
Well, yeah,
there's something of that.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point, because this point of a kind of modern snobbery towards those who came before us, what Lewis called chronological snobbery, that they conjured up. One thinks, for example, of the almost snorting laughter that one gets if one points to the development of the concept of limbo for babies that died without baptism, limbo being a state of natural happiness. And yet you have no less a person than the Thomist, the modern Thomist, Jacques Maritain, who later in his life hypothesized that maybe as a result of the intercession of the saints, God will grant a reprieve to all those who are in hell, and that those who are in hell will eventually all just enjoy a kind of natural happiness, a kind of limbo. In other words, all of these things are an attempt at grappling at the question of particularity. If baptism is necessary for salvation, most people are not baptized. So, and the church does teach dogmatically that there can be no post-mortem conversion.
Hmm.
Well, then maybe we need to take a look at how we define what constitutes post-mortem. Is death simply biological death? Is that maybe perhaps not a modern biologicalistic answer to the question of death? Or are we not dead until God says we're dead, as in the language of the Princess Bride, the movie? He's mostly dead, not dead dead. All right. And mostly dead. All right. And that God, you're not dead until God ratifies your death in a sense and accepts your final decision. I don't know. These are all
Hmm.
highly speculative questions on my part, but it's all
Yeah,
simply an attempt to point out, as you just did, there's more things in heaven and earth, Harish, than
yeah, yeah. I think I think generally, I mean, so that the sort of relatively hard line of death, as we know it, is
Yeah.
something that I think that there have so some of these ideas they're rejected, for precisely those reasons because I think something, and this is one thing where I would have start, I love Balthazar, but where I would start to quarrel is it does seem to me that he pushes the decisive choices or the decisive salvation event away from the cross and into um, Holy Saturday, the afterlife, this sort of always and never almost mythic space. But I don't want to
Well, no,
go
these are
down that
open.
tangent.
Those are profound questions.
Uh-huh.
But anyway,
But
go ahead.
limbo, by the way, so this is another tangent, but it comes up from time to time, and it's something I want to go back to because it is there is, like you say, a certain amount of snobbery about it today, and the arguments against it today that you mostly hear seem to be precisely, well, we don't believe in that anymore. And I kept finding things that are very limbo-like, deeper in the tradition than what I think most of the 20th century people who've written about it or who would be dismissive of it, or even there was a document by the International Theological Commission put out several years ago now, which said limbo had been abolished, and of course it says nothing of the kind. It says limbo is a legitimate theory. But I think it underestimates some of the evidence for something like limbo that you see even among the fathers, and that, in fact, it struck me. So this is one of those things. Being out on the reservation, I did a lot of funerals, and there were a lot of the Lakota funerals there. They tend to be big events. There's a wake that can go on for a long time, and lots of people speak. And the same thing at the funerals. Sometimes you have to. Sometimes too many people speak. But you land the plane. Uh, but but one thing that struck me is I kept hearing over and over again as people were talking, and this isn't something unique to the Lakota. I think that this is something that is American culture in general. The languages would be very similar. People are talking about the afterlife, and they're talking about, oh, so and so is in a better place. But what they almost never mentioned was God. So a better place, but they really didn't think very much about God as being a part of so and so's afterlife. And what I realized was they're not talking about heaven. What they're hoping for is limbo.
Limbo.
Yeah, because
Yeah, when we
it's this
extend that even to
relatively
extend it even to our pets, where when our dog dies,
yeah.
well, I hope he's running around in the backyard in the sky.
Right. Uh-huh. Yeah. I mean, it's more or less a pleasant sort of continuation of this existence, where God doesn't bother us too much. And that really is, that's the Thomistic view of limbo. So I think it's a concept that needs to be delved
Yeah,
into again.
I think it's a very interesting thing because much was made when Pope Benedict came out and said, limbo is not a doctrine of the church. But all he was saying was it's not an official teaching. It's not
Right.
a doctrinal teaching of the Catholic Church. He
Yep.
did not rule it out as a
Right.
speculative theological theory. How could he? It is embedded, ensconced within the tradition, as you point out.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right. So that's, um, That's
Yeah.
something I think you have Gregory Nazianzen, who would be somebody who um, he's one of the cases in the book of somebody who makes a strong case against baptism of desire before there's really a doctrine that's articulated, where he says, if you're not baptized, or he would say strongly, if you're not baptized, you're not saved. That doesn't mean you're punished, though. You could be neither rewarded nor punished. And I would look at that and say, well, that's essentially an insight that's consonant with the doctrine of limbo. Now, all of that said, shortly after Gregory says that, a few years after, in Milan, you do get this classic case of the catechumen who asks for baptism. He happens to be the Roman Emperor Valentinian II, and which is why we remember him and not some of the other cases. But he asks Ambrose of Milan who's his bishop because the imperial seat is in Milan. He asks Ambrose to come and baptize him, and Ambrose makes the journey. And as he's on his journey, Valentinian is strangled by his top general, and this creates a problem and a lot of problems for Ambrose. There is a succession problem in the Roman Empire, and then there's also this problem that there's this dead emperor who isn't baptized, and his very pious sisters and so forth are there at the funeral, and that Ambrose has to speak at, and they know, because everybody knows, that baptism is necessary for salvation. And so, what does Ambrose say? There, you get the first real articulation of what I would call and what the tradition comes to call baptism of desire, where he would say he did everything within his power to be baptized. The circumstances were outside of his control. Surely God will grant him his desire and also our desire, because for Ambrose, his prayers and the prayers of the people are also important. And he had some of the Old Testament precedents and things like that as well that could help to buttress that claim. But it's a controversial claim. You have into the in the Middle Ages, you have Peter Abelard, who's writing and who's saying, Ambrose was being a weasel at that point. He was just telling them what they wanted to hear, and he had no business saying that.
Because it was the emperor, after all. You don't want to
Yeah,
say,
exactly.
"Hey,
Yeah.
by the way, the emperor went to hell."
Right. Yeah. So he was trying to save his own skin. And you also have at relatively the same, so slightly after Ambrose, you have Augustine, unrelated, I think. I don't think that, I think they sort of independently come up with very similar ideas. His exegesis of the good thief. So the good thief is the classic case in Scripture for the precedent of baptism of desire. Because before then, you have the necessity of baptism, you have water baptism. Everybody agrees, however, that martyrs, the baptism of blood is a real thing. There's never really any problem with accepting that the baptism of blood will save somebody, even who hasn't yet been baptized. But Augustine rightly points out that the good thief is not being killed for his faith in Christ. He's being killed by his own admission because he was a bad thief. And he got caught.
He got caught.
And so, he's not, Augustine says he's not a martyr. So there has to be then this, but we have the words of Christ himself saying he's saved. So you don't get better theological evidence than that. So Augustine says, well, then there has to be this sort of third category. And then Augustine, being complicated, also kind of takes back some of what he says later on in his career, and so then that gives evidence to both sides in the debates in the Middle Ages. But that's where you get sort of the classic foundations of baptism of desire.
Yeah. I mean, you could also read the good thief narrative. I've seen this from some as simply an indication, not of a baptism of desire universally now applied sort of willy-nilly,
Right.
but more the sense that one gets that God is not, God has chosen the sacraments and the incarnation and the economy of salvation, but God is not bound by those things necessarily, especially the
Hmm.
sacraments. I mean, we'll prescind from the incarnation in that for a second, because that's absolutely necessary. But the sacraments being the earthly extension of that, God is not bound by that, right?
Well, so this, I mean, so strictly speaking, yes. Now, this is one of those principles that I think ends up getting stretched and
Right.
misused.
That's why I bring it
And
up. You hear it all the
yeah,
time. Well, God
right,
can act outside of the sacraments. He's not bound by the sacraments,
right.
except that
So
he bound himself to the sacraments.
yeah, and so the when that principle gets articulated in the Middle Ages in scholasticism, um, it's paired. I'm not sure exactly who the first one was. Certainly, one of the earliest, though, was Hugh of Saint Victor, and so he says, God is not bound by the sacraments, but we are. So, and that includes our theological speculation. So, um, in terms of what we can say about salvation, in terms of our action with regard to salvation. So, in terms of how we approach the mission and the necessity of the mission, how we approach the necessity of the sacraments. We're bound by what he's
Right. Right.
revealed, and so that means that that principle really does not get you very far in terms of what it does for theological speculation. And some of the thinkers would say things like with this in context. Well, yeah, Christ gives the rule. And this is already getting into that. See, that principle is an example of the legalistic kind of reasoning
It is. Yeah.
that I
Yeah.
want to avoid. Um, and there are a lot of reasons for it because it makes it seem like, well, the sacraments then are really sort of this obstacle that we need to get around in order to attain salvation, and that is the wrong way of thinking about them. So some of the thinkers who already are starting to think in medieval scholasticism in that way would say, yeah, there's a rule for that baptism is necessary. John 3:5. It comes from Christ himself. Christ, because he's the lawgiver, he can make an exception for the good thief. But there are no other exceptions because he didn't make any other exceptions. He said, "You'll be with me in paradise." He didn't say anything about anything else. So, from a strictly legalistic standpoint,
Right.
that it doesn't get you anywhere. So that's where I don't think that's the wrong way of doing
Okay.
of
Gosh,
approaching the problem,
there are so many questions. I mean,
isn't
we've
it?
been at
It's a
this
great
now for
topic.
like an hour. I'm going to have you back on eventually if you're willing to do this, because there's just so
Yeah.
much to unpack. Okay,
Somebody who'll
so
listen to me. That's
well, I feel the same way. So, oh, a captive audience. Uh, okay, so let's where then does this leave us in terms of what we now mean? What is the current state theologically in your mind, the proper, not all the opinions, but the proper
yeah.
theological meaning of baptism of desire, especially in light of this fact that I'm going to mention? We were talking about you like Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, as do I,
Yeah.
but I'm thinking of its encyclical Spe Salvi, where I think it's paragraph 45 or 48, one of those 45 to 48 paragraphs, where he says, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, hell is reserved for the worst of the worst. Most people are going to go to purgatory and then on to heaven. And of course, then the few saints and so forth go straight to heaven. So obviously, Ratzinger has this very expansive view of salvation. Most people are going to get saved in his point of view. Well, that means that he's interpreting baptism of desire very expansively here. So, uh, in a sense,
Yeah.
is Pope Benedict wrong? I mean, it's possible for popes to be wrong in their non-infallible teaching. So go ahead.
So I read that, and I'm going off of my memory on this here. I would read those paragraphs at that point in the encyclical. He isn't giving us sort of
A
numerical
census.
targets.
It's
Yeah,
not an eschatological census. Yeah.
right. I think if I remember correctly, what he's doing at that point in the encyclical is he's trying to defend the plausibility of purgatory. And so he's saying, let's suppose that there are some people we know these are very clear cases, heaven right away, there's nothing that really needs to happen. There's some also very clear cases that, there's nothing you can do to save these people. There's a whole range then of people who would fall into an in-between category, and that would need some work in order to arrive at the beatific vision.
Okay.
And so that makes purgatory plausible. I think it would be a mistake to read that as the middle
as predictive. He's not being predictive.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That said, how to think about it. So some sort of guardrails that I would put around the question is because number one, I think when we're dealing with baptism of desire, there's always necessarily built into the very concept itself a certain degree of uncertainty. I'm blanking on. Being in Rome, I sometimes forget English words. Uncertainty. There's a certain degree of uncertainty built into the very concept itself, because it has to do. It's dependent upon the desires, which is something which are internal to a person, and it's not something objective like that you can see, like the sign of water baptism or martyrdom, which you can see. So there's always going to be a certain degree of uncertainty, to use an awkward phrase, in the concept of baptism of desire. I think that when taking the necessity of the sacrament of baptism seriously, which is, I think, a dogmatic principle that is universally held by the fathers. It's affirmed by the Council of Trent and everyone else. That is a firm doctrinal line. And I also don't think that it is, sort of one of the modern moves with some of those concepts in theology is to sort of empty it of meaning. It becomes so broad that it means everything and nothing. And I think, to some extent, that's sort of the abstraction that happens with Bronner. You see this in a lot of people when they're talking about baptism of desire. Baptism of desire means all of God's action of grace in the world. All of God's action of grace in the world is a very good thing, but I don't think that, if you say, well, that's baptism of desire, then essentially the concept doesn't mean anything. You don't need it as a concept anymore. Use Occam's razor and just get rid of it. So it has to take seriously that necessity of baptism. So I would say, at a minimum, then it means you can't posit alternative paths to salvation outside of baptism. So if somebody says to us, "What must I do to be saved?" As they asked Peter in the Acts of the Apostles, our answer always has to be, repent and be baptized, every one of you, just as Peter's answer was to the people in Jerusalem. So somehow or other, our way of thinking about the possibility of salvation for those who aren't baptized with water, who we haven't seen been baptized, has to be dependent upon this idea of baptism of desire. And our concept of baptism of desire also has to take the sacrament itself as very seriously. And at a minimum, the sacrament itself means it acts as sort of a placeholder, so that we can't put anything else in its place, so that we can't say, well, what you really need to do is be a good person, follow these rules, and then you'll be saved, because that's not the same thing as baptism. What you really need to do is believe X, Y, and Z, and nope, because that's not the same thing. So this is one of the mistakes, I think, that gets made and gets argued about in Baroque scholasticism is they argue about what is the minimum necessary belief that you need to have in order to be saved. And whether is it belief in God? Is it belief in a good God? Is it belief in God who saves? Is it belief in, do you have to have belief in Christ? And once you start to say, well, it's this minimum, then you have to start crossing other things out and say, well, if it's God in Christ, you don't have to believe in the Holy Spirit in order to be saved. And does that and so what I think ends up happening is you end up reducing what you mean by salvation. And you end up with a sort of second class salvation. And so the thing that I want to insist on is holding that end point fixed. That baptism, because it's a ritual, because it's symbolic, there's a sort of open-endedness to it. That it's not, there is doctrinal content to baptism. You're baptized in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. There is a doctrinal content there, but there's a whole lot that's said symbolically that can't be reduced to anything else. And so I would hold that non-reducibility there. And so what this means is that a lot will come down to, everything will end up depending upon having a robust sense of what sort of desire is necessary for the sacrament, and then a robust sense of implicit desire. And to start to get into, and I'm talking a lot here, to start to get, I'll take a breath and let you jump in.
No, this is awesome. These are my favorite kind of interviews where the guest just goes on. Yeah, it's great.
To get into what is a robust sense of implicit desire and what sort of desire is necessary, I want to say that we need to use the sacrament itself and our celebration of the sacrament as our starting point.
That's very interesting. And you're not saying that baptism of desire is simply limited to those who have an explicit desire for this explicit ritual and just for whatever reason never have an opportunity to have it, performed. It's more than that, but also not so much more that it means anything. That it has to, in some way, whatever the implicit desire is, it has to be a desire that incorporates into it what the structured elements of the sacrament actually are. And this is what's just, because I have always been one of those folks, sort of following Cardinal Newman in some ways, who, I think it was Cardinal Newman who said that moral conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ in our souls. I believe it was Newman who said that. So I've always, defined baptism of desire as those people who have pursued the moral good sincerely, based on this aboriginal vicar of Christ in their souls, very sincere, very authentic, very serious in their pursuit of the importance of the moral good, as a kind of implicit desire for what it is that baptism represents and is inclusion into the ultimate good that is Jesus the Lord, participation in the ultimate good that is the Trinitarian God. Now, what would you say to that? That to people like me, that's how I've thought all these years.
Yeah, I would say that seems like it could be a part of implicit desire, but there's always something more, which is what makes it difficult. I mean, it is, so there's, my concept always, it's always better to have explicit desire than implicit desire.
Right.
Because, I mean, so for one thing, I mean, the fathers do address this question, and you get, I was just reading for my confirmation class, Cyril of Jerusalem. And so, he's saying, well, people who are, say, he's talking to the catechumen, say you've done everything good. You've lived a very good life. You've followed all the rules. You're missing only one thing. And it's that contact with with the immersion in the Paschal mystery. And there is something, in the gospel too. I mean, think about the rich young man he's a very moral person. He's morally much better off than I am. He's kept all the commandments, and
Yeah.
he's better off than the good thief. And so in some ways they followed their conscience, but there's still something that's missing. And so that's where I would say that even there's something perilous in even in the position of somebody who's a very good person, that is, it's that mystical more. It's that relationship with Christ, that encounter with the person, and that's expressed in that can only be expressed in mystery. Because
Yeah.
conscience, in some ways, I think we can talk about it. Morally, even we can talk about our duties to God and things like that. But going from there and sort of dutiful obedience to God is something else than dying and rising with Christ. So I would say, so that's where I would say that I'm not denying the possibility of an implicit desire for those people. But what I'm saying is, what we have attempted to identify is probably not enough. That there would also have to be, there would have to be. So I talk about it and try to flush out a little bit more in detail what some of these desires might look like. So I think there would have to be for somebody who's living in a place where Christianity has not been proclaimed, let's say, that that they would, probably maybe be doing their best morally, but also be somewhat unsatisfied with that, and want something more than that, that they might not be able to put their finger on. Because it's also possible that somebody could be, an upstanding citizen and pretty satisfied with being an upstanding citizen and say, that's kind of what I want. And that's like I said, the desire for limbo. That's not that something more. And so that's where there's always this precariousness. There's always this uncertainty outside of the explicit evangelization, which means we're always doing somebody like that, even a good person, we're always doing them a favor by more than a favor, to put it mildly,
Yeah. Oh, that's
by
very.
by presenting them to presenting Christ to
I
them.
like that precariousness. The So what you're saying is that a sort of aboriginal pursuit of the moral good is in some ways related to a baptism of desire, but is not strictly coincident with it. That there are
Yeah.
elements in a baptism of desire, a desire for baptism, that go beyond
Hmm.
simple desire to follow the commandments, simple desire
Yeah.
to, in a sense, be a good person. And that something more is mysterious. That something more
Hmm.
is precisely locked in the mystery of God's economy of salvation, which is precisely why we can't prescind from evangelizing,
Yeah.
because we can't. The story of the good young man is a perfect example. Yeah, Lord, I followed all these commandments, and Jesus said, "Well, if you're going to be perfect, then give everything away." Oh, I can't do that, and off he goes. And it's interesting. Jesus didn't choose that moment to accompany the young man in a process of discernment. He let him walk away, and then turned to the crowd and used it as an opportunity to say, "You see that?
Yeah.
That's exactly why it's hard for a rich dude to get to heaven."
Hmm.
I'm paraphrasing Jesus, obviously, with camels, eye of a needle, camel, all that stuff.
Yeah.
To which the apostles, who were still locked in the mentality of the gospel of wealth, said, "Well, then who can be saved? If rich
Uh-huh.
people can't be saved, who can?" But whatever is impossible for man is possible with God. So contained within that little story is kind of almost everything that we're talking about here. That, okay, it's going to be
Yeah.
hard for him to get saved, but God can do it. uh so there you go. We're left with this hanging chad, as I like to call it, this great mystery.
Yeah, I mean, I would say on the other side too. I mean, where being a moral person doesn't line up necessarily with baptism of desires. Think of that example of the good thief. Um, that this is somebody who has not been a moral person, but there's
Yeah,
this deep dissatisfaction. There is a sense of justice there. There's this, what is it within his heart that makes him reach out to Jesus? Um, we can't know. I mean, we don't. Even if Luke were a lot more detailed than he is, we wouldn't fully be able to grasp what that is. But that is real. That is what that is. So I would point to what that is and say, well, that's
yeah,
what is necessary for baptism
yeah,
of desire. And at the same time, you've got the thief on the other side of him who doesn't have that. And so you can look at the external circumstances and say, pretty similar, but one there is this desire that would lead someone to say, Jesus, remember me, um, and reach
yeah.
out in that way. So it's
Very
some
interesting.
combination of things that would have,
Yeah,
now there are cases where it would be relatively obvious. I think, the catechumen, for example, that those, I think, so I talk about, because I'm trying to avoid giving a pathway, providing an alternative pathway to salvation, because I don't want baptism of desire can never be in competition with actual baptism, with water baptism.
yeah. Good
Um,
point.
so I want to say, we can have grounds for belief, which will in some cases be strong enough to allow us to take certain actions. So in the case of a catechumen who explicitly asks for baptism, I would say, along with Ambrose, our grounds for believing that that person has baptism of desire are really very strong, because they said, I want to be baptized. And so we can go ahead and act as if they have baptism of desire. We can bury them, in holy ground and so forth. That would have been the big question, um, when we're dealing with baptism of desire in the Middle Ages. For example, can you give this person Christian funeral rites? And in a case like that, then I think that you could say, you could act
Yeah,
accordingly. Um,
yeah. Well, we're running out of time, but there's still so many questions I have. Uh, in a lot of ways, what you're saying, the reason why so many modern Catholics, I think, have a hard time with this it's a result of what I call if I were God forms of thinking. Uh,
yeah.
and if I were God, we in the modern world are radically egalitarian about such things. We
Hmm.
don't. So it would seem to me, now playing devil's advocate here, because
Yeah.
I'm still thinking through all this stuff myself, just playing devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
A lot of moderns would say to you, Father Lusvardi, the God you are articulating here is a radically non-egalitarian God
Hmm.
that has offered salvation on a very unlevel playing field.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are some for whom salvation is offered and others that it is not. And so it opens up the question of predestination. What kind of a God are we talking about here? This is a non egalitarian God who doesn't offer salvation universally equally. And so maybe you could address some of those concerns that a modern
Yeah.
egalitarian sort of, hey, wait a minute, that ain't fair. If I were
Uh-huh.
God, I would include that dude, that Jewish guy I know at work is a really good guy. And if I were
Yeah.
God, he'd go to heaven.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I think so. I do think that you do need to avoid a sort of double predestination, which is why I put one of the guardrails as saying nobody can be in principle excluded. So salvation can't be in principle impossible for a group of people, which does affect some of what I get into in the book too, where I talk about baptism of desire
Yeah.
and unborn children, for example. But I don't see any reason, and this is going to be shocking to modern ears, but I don't see any reason in Scripture, in Revelation, in the tradition, that God has to offer an equal opportunity to everyone. I think that He has. I mean that excluding somebody in principle, salvation being impossible for someone, does then run into problems. But I don't think that that he's in any way bound to. And I don't. I mean, I don't think that if you read the story, the chosen people.
Yeah.
Thomas likes to quote in the scripture, God loved Jacob and hated Esau. That there's no reason that everybody has to be equal, have an equal opportunity at salvation, because we're not entitled to salvation. That's where this runs into our modern way of thinking, and I think part of what happens in the 19th and 20th century is you get a lot of our way of reasoning gets shaped in a lot of ways by modern political rhetoric. The whole the egalitarian sort of rhetoric is very powerful, and it shapes the way that we think and the way that we talk. But salvation, it depends upon us getting our rights, and it's based upon us having equal rights. And nobody has a right to salvation. If we got what we deserved, we'd all be in trouble. So thank heavens, literally, that God is offering salvation even to to everyone in some way. But that if he puts out more effort to save Simon Peter than he does to save John, then it's not like John has a right to complain. Yeah, or
yeah. Well, there are
Judas,
parables about that.
exactly. I think that is it's applying a sort of moral categories, judgment on God and on his ways that we just are not entitled to make.
I mean, that's why I call it if I were God forms of thinking.
Yeah.
And we impose upon God this radical modern egalitarianism. And I thoroughly agree with all the examples you cite. I mean, the Bible is full of people being chosen and other people not being chosen. And God favors this person and not that person. And that really, boy, does that irritate us. That rubs us totally the wrong way. But the last question, the last point I'll make here, we really kind of maybe have to wrap this up, is I think for some people, the sticking point would be that's all well and good if for those that God hasn't elected to salvation, if you want to put it this way, or at least God hasn't shown the same amount of opportunity for salvation he's shown to others. If the end result is simply they get to go to Paradise Park in the sky as some sort of limbo, but the alternative among so many seems to be eternal conscious torment in hell.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So that if God doesn't offer me the same opportunities for salvation, there does seem to be something grossly immoral about a God that would bring me into existence knowing that I'm going to suffer eternal conscious torment because God didn't offer me the same level of chances at salvation as he did this other dude. I think that would be the fundament of the objection.
Yeah, and I think that they're actually, in the tradition too, that I think it's pretty clear people aren't going to be, and this is where actually there's a good part in the legalistic reasoning is it becomes very clear that we're not going to be punished for things of which we are not guilty. That we're, that God is not going to unfairly punish us, which is why. So one of the, and this is maybe for the next time, one of the concepts that gets overtaxed and used in misleading ways is invincible ignorance. And what invincible ignorance, what it means, and it does not mean more than this, is that you won't be punished for failure to follow religious precepts that you don't know about. So it's like saying to the good person in who lived before Christianity, that say that they're not saved, that this person is not saved, and we're, in addition to the limbo, we're going to punish you for eating meat on Fridays. that
Yeah.
no, that everybody agrees. And so the people thought about baptism as that sort of thing. Well, you're going to be punished for not being baptized. Well, if you don't know about it, there's not going to be any sort of extra punishment
Yeah. Yeah.
added on. They're not going to be unfair punishments added on. And that
Oh,
I think we're on
yeah.
pretty.
I,
So I think
yeah.
sometimes that gets turned into sort of a boogeyman, and it's unfair when some people criticize the tradition and they say, "Oh, look at the restrictive soteriology that they had." They thought, how mean Suarez or whoever was thinking that most people are in hell. Well, wait just a minute, because the way that he was thinking about hell was really limbo, which is he was thinking most people are going to be, or at least many of them, are going to be happier than you are right now. That they're going to be happier than anybody that you know. They're going to get probably what you actually think heaven is like, because you aren't thinking
Yeah,
about it
yeah,
in
yeah.
terms of the
Oh,
beatific
that
vision.
is so brilliant. I think that is really, really good. That's all good stuff. And the bottom line is this, and we kind of have to go, but the bottom line is why I loved your book and why I think it's a very important book is that these are issues that are really trying the churches. I mean, they're percolating in the church right now, and they've been percolating for a long time. Vatican II moved us in a certain direction. Modern popes moved us in a certain direction. Various theologians we admire moved, but it's still this burning open question. And your book really gives this powerful historical understanding. And that's the beauty of this book, this historical understanding of how these issues have been played out. And I keep saying that the bottom line is if we're going to remain Orthodox Catholics and not succumb to the syncretistic egalitarian relativism of our age, we do have to keep maintaining that water baptism is necessary for salvation, that all
Mm-hmm.
the sacraments are necessary for salvation, that the church is necessary for salvation, faith in Christ is necessary for salvation. And so we have to keep hammering away at that scandal of particularity and
Mm-hmm.
hammering away at what the full ramifications and implications of that are. So I thank you for coming on because this has been, I could keep talking to you for the next 3 hours on all of this stuff.
This is fun. Thank you so much, Larry. Yeah, thanks.
And if you're open to it, we'll definitely have to have you back. If I ever figure out
Sure.
how to do live sort of YouTube, I think I can. I think I can do that. I would love to have you on like a live broadcast if you'd be open to that,
Okay.
so that viewers could, instead of me trying to figure out and play devil's advocate, you're like some people would say this, Father. Those people can actually say that. Yeah,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
you
Yeah,
know.
no, that'd be fun. That'd be fun.
Yeah, that'd
I
be
don't know
great.
how to do it either. So you'll
I'm a
I'm
complete
not that
luddite. Yeah,
technologically advanced.
yeah. I looked it up once and then one tried it and it was a complete failure. But anyway, do you have any last things that you want to add before we sign off?
No, just thanks again for having me on. I do hope, I mean, I think that these, exactly what we're doing of starting to try to think through some of these questions are really important because I think when you start to remove salvation from being at the center of your theological and ecclesial discourse and mission, that's when you get bogged down in a lot of secondary issues, which I think and then it tends to be a lot of divisions and things within the church. So I do hope that this contributes in some way to a sort of reset um, of discussion on what's most important.
Well, thank you. I think it does, and hopefully, I'll have you back on so we can, because I know I'm going to get 100 emails about this, so then I can carry those forward in conversation with you. But anyway, thank you for everyone for listening and tuning in, and thank you so much, Father Lusvardi, for this very, very, very interesting conversation. Bye now.